Good afternoon, and thanks for tuning in to an American Ambulance Association webinar. This webinar is being recorded. The recording link and slide deck will be published in tomorrow's digest for AAA members. The deck, as well as a handout, were also included in the confirmation email and reminder that you received today. The regular chat function is typically disabled for participants in AAA webinars, but not today. This is a highly interactive session. Instead, to ask questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, represented by the double dialog bubble button. You could also use the chat function, or even raise your hand, and we are happy to unmute you so you can ask your question out loud. With that, it's my pleasure to invite American Ambulance Association Chair Alexia Jobson to introduce today's presenter, Smitha.
Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everybody. Good morning if you're on the West Coast, or good afternoon if you are out east. And I wanted to introduce Smitha. I'm very excited to welcome her today to this webinar. Smitha has nearly 20 years of broadcast, public relations, and media experience. She has been involved with countless live events, media tours, and news shows. Smitha has worked for 5 television newsrooms and for all of the major broadcast affiliates, including NBC, CBS, and Fox. Her work behind and in front of the camera has appeared on CNN and HLN. Her most memorable story may be her coverage of former President Barack Obama when he came to visit North Carolina in 2009. Smitha also has extensive experience in media relations, currently serving as a media strategy lead for Amazon. Prior to that, she was an integral part of the earned media teams at several different agencies in New York. She has worked with clients in many fields, including tech, healthcare, consumer, travel, education, and finance. Smitha, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I just want to say I'm so excited to be here with you today. You know, we have so much to cover, and I just want to dive right in. But thank you for the warm welcome. And then I want to give you a kudos. I want to turn it around because, Alexia, I know you have done such amazing work as the chair of our communications committee for the ambulance and for your innovative Thank a First Responder initiative. So I just want to make sure I turn the kudos back to you as well. And thank you for letting me be a part of this today. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much again for joining us. I want to kick it, kind of get started right away. So, why are we all here today? We're here to talk about media relations. So when we talk about media relations, there's a lot of different things that we mean. So I was going on and kind of trying to find the best definition that I could for you guys. And really at the core, I think that it's this. I think it's, the activities that a business or a company, organization uses to try to interact with news media, whether that's press, whether that's broadcast. It really focuses on delivering the news to reporters, to editors, to producers, to anyone who works in a newsroom, who then in turn takes that information and produces it to an audience. And so when I think about media strategy, media relations, they're all under the same umbrella. And really at the end of the day, I think the most important part is how we're conveying those messages about what our company does or what we do to the media. So when we talk about media relations for, this next hour, just keep this in mind. So I'm going to go, that's the definition. And then I want to kind of get into some of the fun stuff. And so I always like to start off with this open discussion. Please feel free to participate. I want this to be, as interactive, as fun as possible. Again, it's such an important thing that I think companies can do to really help as they tell their story, as they shape their narrative. And so I wanted to kick it off by asking if anyone here, and please and thank you in advance for participating, but anyone here, have you done media interviews before? And you can put it in the chat. I know the team is monitoring the chat, but, have you guys done interviews before? I'd love to kind of gauge, is this something that you guys have experience with? Is it something brand new? And I've done these many times, and you always get people that have never done them before, which is perfectly fine, and that's the beauty of joining a presentation like this and really getting to learn. And then there are people that have done them a number of different times, but have different experiences, because depending on if you're talking to the New York Times or if you're talking to your local NBC affiliate, they're 2 very different things that you're going to do. So I know the chat is here. I'll open it up here. here. I do appreciate, again, the participation. And yes, let us know a yes or a no if you've done media before. And we'll kind of monitor this. This can be an open chat as we're going through this. But just keep in mind, people have different degrees of experience with this. So either way, let's get started by talking about kind of the hardest things about doing interviews, right? So this is a question that I get many times. Oh, go ahead.
Smitha,
Sure.
sorry, Patrick has his hand raised. I'm going to let him talk and answer your question about whether he's done media interviews.
Oh,
And we've,
excellent.
and we've
Thank you.
also gotten a few other responses.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys. This is the whole point of this. So I am very glad for that. And Patrick, go right ahead. The stage is yours.
He might be trying to get off mute. But in the meantime, Chad Druten, who runs a service, Paul Landry's are both saying yes. Alberta is saying no. Lots of yeses, lots of nos. Allie says that she's an emergency services public information officer. So we've got a huge mix of yeses and nos here. So I think this is a great audience. We've got the full spectrum of experience.
Excellent. And that's what I love to hear, because I think there are some things that even if you've done this a number of times, it's kind of like, oh, that's a really good thing, or, oh, wow, that's happened to me before. So thank you guys for everyone who answered the question. And, I'm going to kind of turn it back around now and talk about a couple of things that are hard and why people, I think there is a general fear when it comes to doing media interviews, right? And these are all things I've heard many times, when I've done media training, before, after interviews. I think the biggest thing that people tell me, they don't know what to expect, right? When you're doing what we call earned media, you don't have control over what the reporter is going to ask you. And that's a little scary, let's be honest, right? I mean, if you're having a conversation with a friend, it's one thing. But if you're on, on TV, or if you're being interviewed and it's going to be shared externally with a large number of people, of course that is scary. So a lot of times, just always being aware of that, I think, is important, but you will likely not know the questions beforehand. You will know the topic, but then, one thing to remember is that other questions can come up. So we're going to cover that during today's session, is just what can you do when other questions come up? How can you address that? So of course, first and foremost, not knowing what could come up is a little scary. And then kind of hand in hand with that, giving the wrong answer. So saying the wrong thing, right? We all, many of us, or all of us that are probably here today have experienced just having to communicate about what your job is, what your company does. And so when you're taking that and you're sharing it with media, that can always be a little bit intimidating, because again, you want to make sure you're saying the right thing. If it is about an incident, or unfortunately involves a person who has passed away, or, a crime, obviously that makes that layer of complication even more so, where you want to make sure you're saying the right thing and you're not giving the wrong answer. So that's something that people, of course, are afraid of. And then repercussions. So if you do say the wrong thing, or you do, just say not the right answer, or you even say something as you're talking to the reporter, and then you remember, wait, I don't want to say that, it's just kind of the repercussions that can come if that footage is used, for instance, in the interview, and that kind of thing. So we'll cover, really the best way that you can make sure that all of these fears are alleviated is being prepared. So you may not be able to control the questions the reporter will ask, but you definitely can go in, be prepared, be as prepared as possible, and then have general responses, so that if a question comes up, you don't want to answer it, or if something, a topic that you don't want to discuss comes up, just how do you deal with that, right? So that's all stuff that we're going to cover today. And so stop me, at any point. I'm trying to look at the chat. I know it looks like it's disabled for some people, so do stop me at any point if you guys, again, I want this to be as, as interactive as possible, but this is, just to get our conversation started. I thought these were things that were just important to keep in mind of why people are so afraid or so hesitant as they go into doing these media interviews. So for our next topic of discussion, before we go into that, I want to play this video. I'm going to do it. I'm just going to escape this and go into here. So I wanted to play some of these bloopers. So we've all seen news bloopers. I found what I thought was a really kind of interesting mashup of some ones that were online. We're not going to watch this whole thing. It's 12 minutes, but wanted to show the first couple of minutes just kind of to get this conversation started, that, even people who do this professionally mess up, and they mess up all the time. So, as much as you may be afraid going into it and being nervous about what you're going to say, what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, just remember this kind of stuff happens. I'm going to go ahead and play this.
So, true to his word, Demoff read the mean tweets.
But first, I broke out the yellow today, Orange. Or I just called you Orange, Justin. Let's try that again.
It's day 2 of the latest round of games.
Try to get to Paul in just a little bit, and we'll be right back after this.
A lot's changed in the last couple of weeks, and one of the things that I've learned is to just cut myself a little bit of break. There's not a lot of traditional learning going on in that classroom, but that's not to say that my kids aren't learning valuable lessons. We've been having fun doing that.
And what we are finding over the next couple of days here, Wednesday through Friday, 0%, what am I, from Texas?
Christina. Hello
All right,
there.
good morning. Let's do a quick tour of the studio.
Yes, a virtual tour here.
Well, 3 buildings have been destroyed after an intense fire ripped through them in Rumford, and now all that's left is a pile of rubble.
They're closing?
Yes, next Tuesday.
Okay, the last thing I want to be when the end of the world comes is sober.
Guys, quiet or I'm blocking Fortnite.
Keeping it local now this morning, a new tutoring partnership in Nina is helping equip high school girls, Shelly, you're on TV, to pursue their post-secondary dreams.
It's called the Shoulders to Stand On program.
Titingnan mo yung guidelines na yung binabasa ko. Let's say, for example, kung private vehicle, ang allowed is 2 pasahero per row. Ibig sabihin, ang makakasakay lang.
Madeline's got the EP stretch. You see that in the back left? Nice job, Madeline. We got Kevin.
I missed that. You guys missed it. I missed it.
Oh my gosh.
Safe coming up.
All right, so I'm going to stop it there. I think we could all watch that for the full 12 minutes, but you guys get the idea. Obviously these are trained professionals who do this every single day, and even they make mistakes. So, at the end of the day, if you make a mistake, and we'll cover this, really the main thing is holding your composure, as hard as it can be. I mean, in your head, it always feels, a lot longer than, let's say it's just a second that you've maybe messed up a word or said something incorrectly. It always feels longer than it is. So, but the main thing is just holding your composure, not letting it show, and just being, really, really confident, even in the midst of chaos. So those I thought were some fun examples kind of to get us, thinking about how people make mistakes. It's okay, but it's how you, react to it and how you recover, most importantly, from it. So let's start talking about a little bit, like diving into more of these topics. So the first thing I wanted to cover is just proactive media versus reactive media. So, I think when a lot of us watch the news or see something, in the newspaper, a lot of what you're reading is actually reactive news. So that is the reporters or the journalists have gone out and covered a story, said journalist, let's say that you're in Kansas City, the journalist at that local TV station maybe has come and asked you about an incident that happened, about, an emergency that happened, and trying to get some reaction, right? Or let's say that, you didn't give any sound bites, as we call it, you didn't give any reaction, but the story is still being covered in your local market. A lot of that is reactive, right? So it's reporters that have gone out, found the news, are covering it almost one way or another, right? Hopefully you can be part of that narrative, but if you can't, the story is still going to be covered. So that's reactive. That's something that's happened that you see. Where really the sweet spot is, and what, I want to try to have conversations today around, is proactive. So what is proactive? When we talk about proactive media relations, it means that we are going out, we are pitching a story to the media. So it's kind of the tables have turned. What is really nice about it is that we are in a little bit more control of the narrative. We can shape the story. We can say, we had this amazing hero here in Kansas who saved the life of a 7-year-old boy, you know, and now they're reunited a year later, or maybe they're reunited a couple of years later, the boy is, you know, or maybe when the boy's going to college, you know, you can have that really proactive, positive story, and you're pitching it to the media. What's nice is that you're in control of the narrative, not completely, because do remember, you know, earned media, and we'll get to the different kinds of media, but earned media, you know, you don't have total control, but you can pitch that story. So you're already starting off saying, hey, here's the story, here's what it is, here's what I can give you. And that is really what we want to focus on. And I think what happens a lot of times in our daily jobs with what we do, you know, there are so many stories that are happening. There are so many cases across the country that are happening. And so sometimes the focus tends to be on reactive, and we almost forget to take time to do that positive, proactive storytelling. And especially with what all of you guys do, you know, you have these amazing, incredible stories all across the country of heroes who are doing, you know, just extraordinary things every day. And so those kind of stories we can really get to be proactive and pitch to our media. So how do we go about doing this? You know, there really is an art. It's, you know, I call it the art of storytelling, because when you're telling, you know, when you're pitching a story to a local newspaper, a local TV station, or to the New York Times, really the principle is the same. And that's that you want to have, and you want to make sure that you are saying, you know, the best story, and you're making it appealing to the journalist, right? A lot of times, I think when you see a story or you see a pitch, and I've been on both sides, obviously, as a journalist and in PR, and you may get a pitch, and it's almost what we call self-serving, right? There's just too much detail sometimes about what, you know, what the story is. It may even try to include everything right up front. So maybe when the pitch is being sent via email, instead of it being a couple of paragraphs, it's, you know, 2 pages long, and it's talking about every detail about this story. And so something important to keep in mind is that, you know, you want to make sure that your story, it's showing why a broad audience should care. It's, you know, it's really educating the public. So maybe it's, you know, about CPR and, you know, and how that can help the community, as opposed to being something that's really self-serving about an internal event that the company is doing, right? Because that doesn't have obviously as much of an appeal. So I think really keeping in mind that your audience for these stories are people that are outside of the company, outside of the organization. And so educating these people about, you know, what would be relevant, important in their everyday lives. So just how you would kind of, you know, want to maybe tell someone outside, you know, an outsider about what's going on and how this can help this person, the same principle applies when you're thinking about media. So going over now to this, I think there's 2 parts when you're considering, you know, whether you're doing an interview. So let's say that you've done your pitch, you've gotten the interest of the reporter, and now it's, okay, so what are we going to do? How are we going to say this, right? So make sure your pitch, of course, as we said, it's, you know, really it talks about what the bigger issue is, why it's important, why someone should care. Now you've gotten the interest, and what you're saying is going to matter. So we've jumped now to the interview. You've gotten your interview. Go you. That's the hardest part sometimes. But now you have to prepare, and you have to make sure that everything is going right once you actually do the interview. So these are some tips I pulled together. They're pretty, you know, obviously straightforward. But one thing, the mic is always hot. And this is a very important tip. I think people sometimes forget this. I personally have been involved with a lot of media tours, which essentially are just back-to-back TV and radio interviews that you do across the country. There's one spokesperson. You usually do it over the course of a morning, you know, from a 5 a.m. to maybe a noon, and you're just doing back-to-back TV and radio interviews. And it's a great tactic for companies to use because, you know, you can just get your messaging in a TV station in Kansas City, and then you can be hitting up, you know, another TV station or radio station in California, in, you know, San Diego, California. So it's a nice way to really reach a broad audience. But whenever you're doing these, the number one tip that we tell people is that your microphone is always hot. And so this applies if you're talking to a journalist. I would actually say the same kind of principle applies, right? It's always on the record. Your mic is always hot. And so anything that you say can and will be used in the interview. So just something to keep in mind, right? It's, you know, if you go in prepared, and that's, you know, if there's like one thing that you get out of this, really, I want that to be the main thing you think of, is that if you go into it prepared, all of these things, it'll just naturally come to you. So the mic is always hot. And then when you're talking or you're sharing a story, you know, number one, be human, right? So you can speak in sound bites, as they said. You know, we've all watched the local TV news. You'll see the sound bites that are, you know, they're always usually clipped down and they just talk about what's going on. You know, they share emotion. A lot of times you'll see people that are talking about an incident that happened. And, you know, a lot of times, unfortunately, it's tragic. And so sharing that emotion. And so it's okay, you know, if you're talking about an emergency, about something bad that has happened, about a life that has been lost, it is perfectly okay during an interview to show emotion, to show empathy, right? That's always a common theme when we're doing these, especially if it is a bad incident. It's okay to show empathy. And, you know, when you're talking, so of course, these are things to keep in mind. You should speak slowly, clearly, ask for clarification, and then it's okay not to know the answer. And this is a really important one. It kind of goes back to what we were saying before, where people are nervous sometimes to do these interviews because you're so worried you're going to say the wrong thing and not say it in the right way, or, you know, and it's okay not to know the answer. And so, you know, people always ask me, what do I say if I don't know the answer to something? And especially if the question is something that's kind of left field, right? If you're talking, let's say you're talking about a hero story, somebody who saved the life of a 7-year-old, right? And then someone asks you about the budget of, you know, of the ambulance. What's your budget? What's your budget for the next fiscal year? You know, I think it's perfectly acceptable to say, you know, thanks for the question, but we're really here to talk about saving, you know, Tommy's life, and then go back to that. So it's called pivoting. It's a tactic we'll get to later too. But if you don't know the answer, it's okay. And it's okay to shift back to what, you know, what the point of the interview is and why you're there. So just some tips to keep in mind as you get started. Now, what you do is also just as important. I know this image is silly, but I thought it was funny as I was going through the best images for this. So, you know, think of it like this. Just think that this dog, this guy over here, he looks pretty confident. He obviously is getting a lot of media attention, a lot of questions about something. So just remember this when you're going into an interview, right? Be open and confident. That is the key. And I can't stress this enough, because I think what happens is, again, people get nervous, understandably, and then that confidence goes, and then you no longer have control of the interview. So just go into it if you are prepared, if you know what you're talking about, if you go into it, you spend some time doing practice interviews. You know, it's okay to sit in front of the mirror, to have a friend help and do these practice interviews. If you go in open and confident, you are prepared and you know what you're going to say, you will fly with passing call. You know, you will excel. So make sure, same kind of note, what we've said a little bit before, control the conversation. You are doing a proactive story. This is your story that you have pitched to the media. The media is there because of you. So it is perfectly fine to control the conversation, control that narrative. You know, you want to make sure you're getting the messaging across that you want to, and you have this incredible story to share about someone's life being saved. And so it's totally okay to, you know, control the conversation, get your messaging points across. And then do ask for clarification if you need it. I think this is one too that is interesting, because it comes up where people are just kind of afraid to ask for clarification. You know, it's like, oh, I don't really know, you know, what this person was asking. And then instead of, you know, asking like for clarification, it's people get stumbled or kind of say, oh, you know, get all frazzled. It's okay. It's okay. Just especially if it's a recorded interview and it's not live, it's okay to say, hey, you know, can you rephrase that? Or can you just like, tell me what, you know, I want to make sure I give you the right answer. Can you reword that a little, or can you just clarify exactly what you're asking? That's totally fine. And you know what, even if it's a live interview, it's okay to say, you know, can I get a little more information? And then always have in the back, kind of in your back pocket, some, like I call it a clutch, right? So always have like kind of something that you could go back to. So, okay, can you clarify that? And let's say the question, again, it's still confusing. It's about budget. It's about something unrelated. Have that messaging point. You can say, okay, well, you know, Tommy, we really are here again to talk about Tommy, you know, and go back into it. So it's okay to ask for clarification if you're not getting it, if it's getting too confusing, it's okay to go back to that. And then we already talked about this one. Don't be afraid to show emotion. I think that's so important to remember, especially when you're dealing with these tragic stories, and don't repeat the negative. And this is something people actually have done without even realizing. So let's say you are getting a question that is inappropriate or that's just totally off topic, people will sometimes say it again. And then, especially if it's a recorded interview, let's say for a TV station, it could be used, right? So don't repeat anything that you don't want. And this is one that takes a little bit of practice for sure, but don't repeat anything that you don't want out there, because that is, that's something that then once you say it, it's in your own words, it's out there. And so just try to always just keep, kind of keep what the mission is and what you want to get across, just keep that with you at all times. So these are just some tips. Hopefully you find them helpful. Yes.
So when you're saying don't repeat the negative, would you give us an example? It doesn't have to be from EMS by what you mean by that.
Absolutely. Yes. And thank you for asking. That's a good point. So let's say somebody says, well, you guys didn't respond to this incident and it took you 5 hours. Don't say, it didn't take us 5 hours for this incident. What do you mean? Don't repeat that narrative, right? And especially if it's not true, don't repeat that. Say, we're really here to talk about the success of this story. This happened. We're really here to talk about this today. So don't repeat if there's that negativity or just that kind of false narrative. And sometimes, people, and we've all seen these interviews where people kind of push for something, just try not to repeat that, because when you repeat that, it's just, you're saying it again. It's being put out there again, right? Or even it could be edited in some cases to be, to be used with something else. Now that doesn't, usually reporters are honest, but just don't repeat anything that's negative, and especially nothing, if it's not true, try not to repeat it. Just say, again, we're here to talk about this. And that's called pivoting. That's something that you'll see that happens a lot in interviews when that happens, and again, it's not, I don't want to scare anyone. That doesn't happen all the time, but these are the situations to be prepared for, because this is why I think people sometimes are afraid to do media interviews, because they're just not, they don't know about these things or how to handle them if they come up.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Yeah, of course. And I'll stop here. Are there any other questions? Like I said, I'll definitely keep talking if you let me, but if there are any questions, great opportunity to kind of stop and see, how people are feeling about this information. I'm throwing a lot of information at you, so definitely would like, any feedback or any questions.
Not seeing any questions, but I did just want to let you know that we have dozens of states represented here. So this is a national broadcast, but you're very familiar with those.
I am. And I love that, because I think every market, is so unique and so special, but there are some commonalities that we all have too. And that's why I think when you're doing these media interviews, it really is fascinating to see, okay, a story that maybe resonates in California may not resonate in New York, but there are some similarities. And some of those are, a hero's a hero, right? No matter where we are, that story is always going to resonate. It's always going to be impactful, because at the end of the day, it resonates with people. And again, everything that we do goes back to just being a human first. So we'll move on, and, again, stop me if anyone has any questions or wants to talk about anything, but let's go into what is newsworthy. So this is one of the most common questions that comes up, right? Because you're like, okay, I hear you. I want to pitch my story. I want to do a proactive story. But what the heck is newsworthy? What are the journalists in my area, in my state, in my community, what are they actually going to care about? So when you're thinking about what's newsworthy, we'll go over, local versus national, which, Amanda, as you just said, we have a national audience, but we have people from different markets, right, all across the country. So for instance, I'm based here in New York City, and I can tell you, the stories that are newsworthy. I mean, it has to be a pretty compelling story, because we just have a lot of news in this market, right? There's millions and millions of people that live in New York, and there's always, unfortunately, crime and, things that are happening across the city. So what's newsworthy here could be different than obviously what's newsworthy in the Midwest or in another market. But the way that the news is structured with local and national and with storytelling is always the same. So it's kind of one, tip I tell people: if you're not familiar with your local market, get familiar with your local market news, right? So start, reading the newspaper, start watching the news. The great thing is, you can watch clips online from your local TV stations, just kind of see what are some of the stories that are being covered and what seems to be a priority in your region. region. So in some areas and some TV stations are different. Some media outlets are different from one another. So, some TV stations may only cover hard news stories, but then you'll see, oh, okay, on the weekends, they tend to do some softer stories. And so, some softer news stories that aren't about crime, but maybe talk about the community more or talk about people or more people-oriented stories. And so I think thinking about that and keeping that in mind, and the more aware you are, particularly of what's being covered in your local areas, the kind of the easier some of this stuff gets too. So, watch your local news if you're not, because that's definitely, you can always learn a lot and definitely learn a thing or two. So local versus national, national is different, and national obviously is a great tool to reach people as well. But I do want to stress, if anything, as we're talking about how everyone here is in different markets, just remember your local news is great. And if you really want to drive home a point, if you really want to, hone in on messaging, actually your local market news is such a great tool for doing that. And, I had years ago someone who told me, I was on GMA. It was a gym. It was like somebody who owned a gym. He said, I was on GMA, which was great. Said it was exciting. It was fun. We did this really, really cool thing, this really cool TV segment. He's like, but then I was on my local news, and he was in Arkansas. He was like on my local news station. And he's like, more people saw that and more people responded to that. And more people came to my gym because of that than the GMA segment. So when you think about kind of, appeal and who's watching and really what you can take out of it, keep in mind national versus local. Sometimes local is the sweet spot. So that always has stuck with me ever since then. So, inside the mind of a journalist, kind of what I can provide hopefully for you, just from my time in TV, is that journalists, they want stories too, right? And especially if you guys, I know you're all throughout the country, but in some of these markets, the smaller to medium-sized TV markets, I can tell you, reporters really want your stories, because one of the responsibilities of a reporter is to pitch stories, and we'll focus on newsrooms specifically, but this is true of the print as well. But, you have to pitch stories every day, right? So when you're a journalist, you're kind of starting off your career, maybe within the first 10 years of your career, you have to pitch stories. You're still responsible for that. And really, even some of the most successful reporters, pitch stories even to this day. But let's say, you're starting off in these local news markets. So pitching stories. So by having a good story and proactively going to a journalist in your market and saying, hey, listen, I saw that you covered this story. I have something very similar that happened, or, hey, there's this anniversary, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the supermarket shooting in Buffalo, New York, this anniversary is coming up. I have this EMS hero who was involved, who saved, the lives of XYZ. Would you be interested in speaking with this person, right? Assuming that obviously you've already arranged all of that and made sure it's okay with him, with this hero. So it's those kind of things, going proactively to a journalist. You're actually helping this person out. And whenever you are pitching a story, again, it's really about thinking, okay, let me go inside the mind of this journalist. What would be exciting or interesting, and what would really resonate with people in this community? And so just like you would think of that, your journalist is thinking of that too. And so, when these people are going to their newsrooms, they usually have meetings in the morning where they go over all of the story ideas, and you make this person, let's say you pitch it to your local reporter, Joe Smith. You make Joe Smith look great if you have a really compelling, interesting story that is unique, that Joe says, hey, I spoke with Amanda and she told me this great story idea, and here it is. So this is a unique story. It's about a hero in the community who has, saved lives, done all these amazing things. It's really a win-win situation. So by doing that proactive outreach, by working with Joe, and by Joe then taking that story, pitching it to his newsroom, and then of course that story coming to fruition, that's really the best win-win scenario. So that's just some information about what is, kind of what it takes. And then people, again, this is another thing that I think is important to keep in mind. How do you establish these relationships with journalists, right? So when I was a journalist, I can share this, I would get a lot of pitches, and, a lot of them were okay. They were interesting, maybe something going on in the community, and, okay, this person, and one thing, that always I appreciated, and I do now too, when I'm doing PR, is that I want to know, okay, so please tell me as many details as possible. What is the story? who can talk about it on camera, who can talk about it if it's print, who can be interviewed for this. Why is this important? Why should people in my community care? Going back to that, what are the logistics? Have you thought through, okay, you're offering me an interview. Can you tell me when or where? And it can be broad. It doesn't have to be, tomorrow at 2 p.m., but it could be, this person is available in the mornings. Is this something we could arrange? You could do it at, XY location. If we're doing a media ride along, which I know is something that you guys do, is this something that we could do, on this set date, and we can arrange, we've already made the arrangements, being as specific as possible, because I think one thing that you definitely want to avoid that does happen a lot is not being as specific as possible. So not saying, hey, this is what the story is, here are all the details, here's video, right? If you're talking to a TV reporter, here's video. Just being as clear about that as possible. If you're talking with a print journalist, here is the time this person is available for a phone interview, right? So it's just laying all of that out in your pitch that's important. But again, what we were saying before, you don't want to overwhelm them, right? You don't want to have, 7 pages of PFD attachment that you're just, that you're sharing in your pitch. You want to make sure it's clear, concise, but includes all the necessary information, because that's one thing that'll get you, it'll secure you a nice relationship with a journalist. Another thing too is that, don't be afraid to, if you have a great story, reach out to a journalist. But even if you don't, right? Even if you're just trying to form some connections with people in the local community, even if it's, hey, listen, I saw that you covered this story. It was great. Nice job. Even just sending stuff like that, because I think sometimes people only reach out when, when there's a story or there's something to be covered. It's okay to just reach out and just try to form that, start that professional relationship and say, hey, listen, I saw this. I think it was great. Nicely done. People, especially people that are kind of starting off in their careers and some of these, small to mid markets. I mean, they love hearing from people in the community who are saying something, or, hey, I saw, you had a picture of your kid. That was so nice. Thanks for sharing. That kind of stuff does resonate. And believe it or not, it actually does. Then it's like, oh, okay, so I heard from Sarah. Oh, okay, this is the same Sarah who said this, right? If then you do have a story, and then it doesn't seem as, as you're much self-serving. It seems kind of like, okay, this person, I remember this communication before. Let me look at this story and consider it. So that's a nice way to kind of develop those relationships with reporters in your market. And then, if there is something that is really compelling, I mean, a good story is a good story. And so there are two options. You can send it directly to a journalist, but you could also send it to, like, every newsroom has assignment desks, or they have some kind of an email alias that you can send. So if it's a really strong story and you don't know anyone at the outlet, at the media outlet, it is perfectly fine to send it to the main newsroom email alias, call out what the story is, but keep those same things in mind, right? Make sure it's very specific, make sure that you have all the details outlined, and it's just a nice, clear, what's the story, why should people care, and what are the details? Just make sure all of that information is included. So hopefully some helpful tips there to kind of get you started. Now, I'll again say, if there's any questions, we're going to go into now some specific things, again, with what you guys do. But if there's any specific questions, feel free to interrupt me. And if not, we can kind of go right into this.
So just to echo what you were saying about building relationships with journalists, Chris Truitt recommended asking the local station if they have new reporters that need to practice interviews as a great win-win.
Yes, that's a great tip. That's a really great tip, Chris, because it's, to your point, that win-win, right? And that's, I think, actually just remember that win-win. So, okay, it's a new reporter. And I will say, being on that other side of it, I mean, it's nerve-wracking, right? You're doing live TV interviews. I mean, I know a lot of people that go in front of the camera that are doing, interviews on the PR side or on the other side are nervous, but so are the people that are just starting off and doing it. And sometimes even people that have been doing it for years. I mean, you saw the bloopers, it's still, those things still can happen. And so, yeah, doing a practice, I think that's a great tip, because it's, it's new for him, it's new for her. And so being able to do that, you're, helping yourself and really, I mean, practice interviews or doing this kind. I mean, you can even do it with, a friend, with a parent, with anyone who can just kind of help you. I've had people that I know, spokespeople I've trained who said, hey, I did it in front of the mirror. I said it felt kind of silly at first, but I really was able to, practice what I wanted to say. And then when I did it for real in front of the camera or in front of the reporter, it came out really well because I'd practiced, right? I mean, it's even when you give a presentation, some of us may do that. We may practice, we may like ahead of time, just go in and do a mock run through or, rehearsal. And that's all perfectly fine to do. So thanks, Chris, for that tip. Definitely a good one.
Smitha, I just also want to underscore your point about making connections and relationships with local media. I think especially when there's some sort of high profile event, good or bad, and national coverage appears in your local area, we tend to get stars in our eyes and, really work really hard to accommodate those national media outlets. And really, you want to make sure that you are treating your local news media with just as much, if not more, attention and love during those situations. Because when, the dust settles or the good news evaporates or whatever, those national affiliates will go away and you're left to work with your local journalists. And so you want to make sure that you're giving them as much, if not more, attention during those moments.
Absolutely. Such a good point too. And I mean, your local journalists really are the ones that are invested in the communities that, care. I mean, honestly, that really care about what they're putting out because, they live in these communities, right? So of course, sometimes people have to cover bad stories. It's just, they have to cover negative stories or they have to cover things that have happened. But at the end of the day, these are people that are invested in your communities. They're invested in, having relationships and forming, friendships with people in this area. So absolutely local journalists. And that's something that, I worked in local news and I always thought it was honestly so much cooler than national news, just because you're really getting to know people in your community and your stories are more impactful that way. So yes, if you do, if you're a national reporter on the Today Show, of course, your stuff, of course, it is very impactful. It reaches a broad audience, but sometimes that, just that story of the local family who has had their life changed in a positive way, sometimes that story and just seeing the impact that you can make on a family like that. I mean, sometimes that's, a lot more rewarding and just seeing it so directly and knowing it's in your community, right? There's something to be really proud about that. Okay, excellent. So anything else before we move on? If not, we'll talk about ride-alongs, something you guys are very familiar with. Now, media ride-alongs. Has anyone done one before? And I will try to pull up the chat if I can here. There we go. Yeah. So has anyone done a media ride along? And I'll keep talking as you guys can discuss that. But these are such great ways to secure positive coverage. Now, there's a lot that, of course, and team, ambulance team, feel free to chime in here too. But there's a lot that you have to consider, a lot of preparation that has to be done before you do a ride along. But what is really, really nice, they're just very impactful stories. And so when you're pitching this to, a journalist, kind of the same things that apply for a regular pitch would apply here too. So just make sure you're really clear. What is the journalist going to see? What access? I think that would be a big question for me, is what kind of access am I going to get? Being really super clear about that. What am I going to be able to see? What am I going to be able to shoot video of? Is there anything off that I can't, So being able to see that, what kind of interviews am I going to get? What sound bites am I going to get? What story am I going to be able to tell from doing this? I think being as clear as possible with this in some ways is even more important than a normal pitch, just given kind of the sensitivities of it and going into it, what to expect, making sure that's really clear to the journalist. And I do see that there's a couple of comments. Yep, that's going on here. Yep, and you have 0 calls. So yeah, and that is a good point too, right? It's that, sometimes, but you know what, to your point, making sure that's clear to the journalist. This is what you can expect. This is what could happen, but this is also what couldn't happen, right? So just being as clear as possible about what the expectations are. So I had one more here. I had a little pause here. So any other questions? Again, I think we've covered a lot. We still have a little bit to get through, but any questions, anything that comes up, anything you guys want to talk about ride-alongs?
Smitha, it's Amanda from the AAA. I know you said not to be self-serving, but I did need to promote the AAA's Congressional Ride-Along Toolkit for ambulance ride-alongs. I put a link in the chat. and encourage everyone who has not previously invited a member of Congress or a local elected official or a member of the media, to your point, on a ride along to review the toolkit just to make sure that they have all of their HIPAA duckies in a row. And it helps with some of the logistics that you mentioned that can be a little bit complicated with ride-alongs. So please, almost everyone on here is a AAA member. Download the ride-along toolkit, and that should get you most of the way there to showcasing what you're doing at your service to visitors.
And Amanda, for that, you can be as self-serving as you want, because that's a very important tool and definitely something important to call out. So thank you for that. Okay, so I think seeing no other questions, I'm going to move on. And for this, I wanted to give you guys time to read this article. And if I see there's movement in the chat, I'll go here to see. Yep, even with 0 calls, prep your crew so that they can chat with reporters about what they normally see in calls that are typical, explain the equipment, how posting plans work, education that medics and EMTs have. And that's a great point because and hello, Massachusetts. Thank you for sharing that. But that's a great point too, Alexia, because you still can have a story. So let's say there's 0 calls, right? Going back to the ride along before we move on, you could still have a story. There's not, anything to say you can't, but just making sure you explain. So, and again, and remember one thing too, and this is something that sometimes people forget, is that for you, this is stuff you guys do every day. You're so familiar with it. But for a reporter, this is brand new, right? So everything seems exciting. Everything is interesting. Something that might be, oh, okay, this is common. This isn't that exciting for us. It's really exciting to someone on the outside because it's not something that this person sees every day. And then obviously sharing it with the audience, it's something that most people there don't necessarily see. So keep that in mind. Just because it's something you're used to or you do, it doesn't mean that everyone does. So definitely there are still ways to go about it. If there are 0 calls or if there's a lot of activity, you can still get a really nice positive story about, what the job entails. What is a day in the life of an EMSer? That's still something that could be covered even if there isn't an actual situation. So now I'm going to pause and give everyone just a couple of minutes to read this. And so this was an article that I found. I wanted to, give everyone time to read it. Oh, sorry about that. I wanted to give everyone time to read it, and then we can have a discussion. And I have a couple of points that I've put here. So let me just link to this. And this goes to another site. So just give it 1 second. So this was an article that I saw, I'm sure everyone is familiar with this headline or something similar, ambulance responses are too slow. We've all heard that, unfortunately. Now, if you guys want what might be helpful, I can play the article too. I'll go ahead and do that. It's about 3 minutes. There is an ad, so just a heads up, but I'll go ahead and play the article and that way we can all listen to it. So I'll be back on the other side of this.
The city managers of Pleasanton and Livermore are demanding that Falck Northern California improve its ambulance services response times in the 2 cities. Livermore City Manager Mariana Sheva and Pleasanton City Manager Jerry Baudon said in a letter to David Torres, Falck's managing director, that from May to October 2023, Falck was slow to respond to 17% of their calls to a... Just a quick word from our sponsor.
That's the sound of your next vacation. And it's fast approaching. Really fast if you're a BJ's Wholesale Club member. Because BJ's Travel offers better value than you'll find anywhere else on cruises, even from the cruise lines. And we back that up with our 110% best price guarantee. Plus, BJ's members can also receive up to a $500 BJ's gift card on qualifying cruises. Simply visit travel.bjs.com to set sail for less today. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details.
The Livermore Pleasanton Fire Department. Of calls requiring a Code 3 response, priorities with lights and sirens, Falck showed an extended response that averaged 7.2% of the time from May to September, the city managers wrote. About 1 of every 6 medical 911 calls in Livermore and Pleasanton have extended ambulance response times, Baudon and Mary Sheva noted in their letter. The expectation of our community is a quicker ambulance response when 911 is called. Falck, a for-profit company that provides services to 1.6 million Alameda County residents, offers paramedics and ambulances at medical emergencies responded to by the Livermore Pleasanton Fire Department, as well as non-emergency transport of patients. The letter did not include how many minutes it takes for Falck to arrive at an emergency scene, just the percentage of times ambulances were considered late. Jeff Lucia, a Falck spokesman, said in a statement that Falck officials met with the city managers last week. Falck cares deeply about the health and safety of people in the communities we serve, Lucia said. We continuously monitor readiness, response performance, and quality of care using local, national, and international expertise. Lucia said Falck works closely with Alameda County health regulators on an ongoing basis to make improvements to the system, are jointly exploring the concerns expressed in the letter. The extended response times come at a time when both Livermore and Pleasanton are joined with the Alameda County Fire Department, ACFD, to negotiate a new contract to address emergency medical services in the cities. The current contract that began in 2019 is set to expire this year. This is not the first time Falck has been criticized for slow response times. In January 2023, reports to the Pleasanton City Council showed Falck arrived late to Code 3 calls 16% of the time in Pleasanton and Livermore in October 2021. That 84% on-time response rate was below the required 90% in their contract for service. As a result, both cities authorized their city managers to negotiate with Falck, but also look at alternatives to the company. However, because Alameda County holds the exclusive rights to determine ambulance services for the region, including in the Tri-Valley, individual cities cannot negotiate their own ambulance services to work with their fire departments. Wodan and Mary Shava's letter also indicated that Falck officials met with Tri-Valley elected and appointed leaders in 2022 to discuss steps the company was taking to improve its response times. In an email to The Independent, Mary Shava said Falck has hired additional drivers in recent months and indicated the company is working to make improvements. Several factors still work against Falck and the emergency response industry, Mary Shava said. One of these factors is the time it takes for ambulances to transfer a patient to an available emergency room bed. We continue working collaboratively with them on the solutions, Mary Shava added. Among such solutions may be a new type of an emergency response contract that is currently under review by Alameda County.
Okay, so I know, and I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I do know these always go so fast, but I did want to just see if there were any initial thoughts, and I saw in the chat that obviously you guys have experienced this, and I will say this really goes back to the power of proactive pitching, because if this had been something that had proactively been already a conversation had started about, stories, positive stories, it's always about kind of offsetting, right? There's this negative coverage that's come, but then if there's positive coverage about, maybe a hero story in this market or something positive that's happened, it kind of offsets some of that negative. So I think, my question, I'll open it up and then we can open it up to questions because I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. But, for something like this, you guys obviously, it seems like have some personal experience. What do you think, if anything, can be done?
So, Smitha, I just wanted to hop in here and say that I was just blown away by what a great job Jeff Lucia, who many of us know, did in catching inbound javelins from a news story, a news story that was clearly coming at his organization with maybe a neutral to negative approach, right? Mm-hmm. This was not a fluff piece, so it was nice to see him have such well-practiced and thoughtful responses to their questions.
Absolutely. And these are not easy questions, right, Amanda? That's something to keep in mind. Like, these are not easy questions at all. They're tough questions. And so that definitely does deserve, some appreciation and applause. So I know we're getting kind of tight on time here. I'd like to go, so we can just maybe go, Amanda, to the last slide, right? Let's talk about some of these examples, just given the time that we have. So we wanted to give you guys, and Alexia, thank you for joining me back on camera. We did want to give you guys some examples of, real life scenarios. These are things that you've all dealt with. I'm going to just move this so you guys can see them. So these are, 7 scenarios. We won't have time to get through all of them, but we're going to go, Alexia, do you want to kind of go through the first one? We're going to talk about some of these things because these are, this now that we've talked about all of the training and what you can do, these are things that you guys, have seen happen in your communities.
Sure, absolutely. I think number 1 is a good one to start off with. And then we have a request to address number 5. So we'll try to get to both of those specifically. Call volume is up in any town. So EMS response times are much longer than usual. Angry parents call the local news to complain that a 9-year-old with a broken leg waited 90 minutes for an ambulance. So we'd love to hear from our participants. I know some of you have experiences with a very similar situation or scenario to this. feel free to pop your comments into the chat and maybe let us know how you would respond to this. So I would first start, as we wait for some answers to roll in here, I would start by asking what the reporter's deadline is. And I would want to get a little bit more information internally about that call. So I would want to make sure that from a public relations standpoint, I have all of the details. And then choose a subject matter expert that would be appropriate to put on camera, someone that already feels confident, because this is obviously a touchy story when we're dealing with a child in particular who is in pain, and 90 minutes, which is what feels like a very extended amount of time to be waiting for care. So you want to put someone who has some clinical expertise, probably someone in uniform, probably someone with some authority, and that feels comfortable talking to the media. Any other thoughts about how we would want to respond to this? Yes, great. How specific were directions? Okay. So we also want to make sure that we are, accepting our responsibility for, in terms of the agency or the organization. And in fact, is that a delay? Is 90 minutes a delay in your community for this kind of call? Some of that matters. So yeah, showing emotion, showing empathy, as Smitha mentioned at the beginning, acknowledging that this can be a very difficult situation, maybe even offering alternate resources. Smitha, what do you think? What would you as a reporter want to kind of hear from the agency about this?
Absolutely. So I think, first of all your points are spot on. And I think for me, it would be, and I think sometimes we see this, right, where people kind of dodge the question, like, did this person wait 90 minutes, right? And just being, yes, here's what happened, right? Like as much as you can disclose. I think taking that ownership too, because I think one of the, you want to come off authentic too in front of reporters. And sometimes you get complaints that, well, just answer my question, right? And there's some questions we can never answer, let's be real. But for something like this, it did take 90 minutes, but then again, collecting all of the information, like you said, and then deciding, being prepared and deciding what we're going to say. And then, saying, we are sorry this happened. Here's what we're going to do so it doesn't happen again. Here are some steps we're taking to try to make sure it doesn't happen again, right? So it's taking kind of the accountability and then saying, because I think that would be a natural progression is, okay, so what are you going to do so it doesn't happen again? So just being prepared to answer all of those questions.
Great. All right, so before we wrap up, I know we're short on time, but we did want to address number 5. We had a call out for that one. A local investigative reporter does a feature on a 1-mile ambulance transport that cost a patient $1,500 as it is not covered by his employer's health insurance. Yes. So, and just to pop back over, I see, Patrick, you mentioned a lot of missing information around the circumstance of that call. And I think that's a great point. When a reporter reaches out to you with a story or a question about something, it's okay to ask them questions about, tell me a little bit more about how you became aware of this phone call or this, this, so you can kind of get a little bit more background from them so that you are getting the right information to share back with them. If there are nuances, you definitely want to know that. So going back to this 1-mile ambulance transport that had a high cost, have we experienced this in different areas across the country? I am sure. I know we've all seen some news clips about it. So how would we respond? By paying insurance premiums? Yes, we do our part. Let me also just say, as a shameless plug here, the American Ambulance Association has some great resources in terms of talking points or some fact sheets that PIOs and media relations folks can reference in order to prepare messaging around this. So again, I think you want to, from an internal perspective, get details about this call, understand a little bit more if you can about the patient or the cost for the transport. Was it an exceptionally high level of care? That sort of thing. And then, yeah, kind of making sure that there's all the parts to the story, including, that insurers are falling down on covering mobile healthcare needs and, really kind of rounding that out a little bit. I also think there's opportunity beyond just participating in the news story element of this. And then Smith, I'd love to hear your perspective as well, is making sure that the other piece of this is taken care of, in as much as, is there information on your website available for families who maybe have financial hardships, or, you know, is your billing office using best practices in terms of collection and things like that? So kind of trying to create a holistic public relations response to this, not just speaking to the reporter and hoping for the best. You really want to pull back and look at opportunities to, to create a better outcome here.
Absolutely. I agree with everything you said. And it's really doing your research, right? It's first, I mean, and I think actually I will say, I think this is, you bring up a good point. You know, sometimes when these things come, or when you get this media request, I mean, the first reaction is just, it's a gut reaction, right? It's like, oh gosh, what just happened? Or this is very jarring. This is, you know, very intense, but it's collecting all the information, making sure you have all of the facts first and foremost, and then solutions. I think that's the thing. I think coming up with like, what are we going to do? You know, so this, you know, or what are some solutions? What you just kind of said, right? What are other options? Like really doing research, doing the digging. And then you hit on something that is so important, those messaging docs, you know, those are just, they have saved so many people over the years, because it's just all the information that you could ever need, and being prepared, of course, going back to that, going into an interview and having all that, those are so important for success.
Perfect. And I'm hoping we have time for one more question, because Jim O'Connor, our colleague from New York, has been very patient. He was hoping he could get your insights about what are the rules about going off the record or on background.
Oh, yes. And this is such a great question. So thank you for asking it. You know, it's that, so off the record, and there is a clip I just saw recently about this. So off the record, I mean, it's a tool that people use, right? I mean, it's obviously something we've all heard of. I would say the rules are that if you, now it's kind of the first thing to gauge, right? Do you have a existing relationship with this reporter? Is this someone you'd call a friendly, right? So friendlies are, of course, people you've worked with before that you trust. You've built that trust. So I would say first and foremost, I'm always a little wary of off the record, because it really depends, I think, on the nature of your relationship with the reporter. Is it a reputable news source, right? Is this someone you trust? Is this a news source you trust? Because, I mean, the reporter should honor the off the record and, you know, get it in writing. That would definitely be my big suggestion. Just get it in writing. But I would really suggest, I mean, there's some times where, you know, off the record makes sense. I think a lot of times, unless you have a relationship or, again, that trust built with the reporter, I think it can be a little bit, you know, you have to just kind of weigh the pros and cons. Like, why is there information that you want to share off the record, right? Because at the end of the day, the reporter isn't your friend. You know, it is somebody who could take this information and use it, whether it's intentional, whether it's not intentional. So I would just say use caution first and foremost, going into that and saying, okay, I want to share some information with you. It is off the record. Or we do sometimes what we do is embargo pitches, right? So this is embargoed information. I trust you. It's saying, I trust you. Can you confirm in writing that you will not release this information, right? So that kind of happens. You've seen that happen too. But I would say just kind of gauge the trust with the relationship. If you see someone else has worked with this reporter before, maybe just say, hey, is this someone that you think I could trust with some information, right? Because I think that's the main thing, that trust. You have to build that, and just knowing the right person to go to with the off the record conversation. Anything, Alexia, that you'd like to add?
Nope, I think you covered that really well.
Thank you. And thank you. Great questions, guys. Great interaction. So I appreciate, you know, all of the back and forth. This is what makes these things so fun.
Well, it's hard to believe, but we're already 2 minutes past the top of the hour. So Smitha or Alexia, any parting comments before we release everyone back to the rest of their days?
On behalf of the AAA Communications Committee, I just would like to say thank you, Smitha, so much. Having someone outside of our EMS profession share these tips with us, and with such an incredible background in media relations, we really appreciate your time and your energy. I can tell, and I tell folks this all the time, I love to geek out on this kind of thing, and I can feel that same vibe from you. So we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today.
Absolutely. And I just want to throw it back and say thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. You know, it's really been enjoyable. To your point, it's flown by as it always does. But, you know, hopefully you guys can use these in real life. And again, thank you for your time today and your attention. I really appreciate it. And it's been nice spending time with everyone.
Thank you all for joining us for another American Ambulance Association webinar. We will send the recording of this session out in tomorrow's Daily Digest. You received a copy of the deck as well as Smitha's generous one-pager handout in the confirmation reminder for this session, and we will also include those in the digest tomorrow as well. So thank you again, Smitha and Alexia, and we look forward to seeing you on a future presentation.